They were children. They were kings. And they disappeared, without a trace. Welcome to Whispers Through Time, where history reveals what it tried to hide. Tonight, we uncover a mystery that has haunted England for centuries. Two princes entered the Tower of London, and were never seen again. Stay with me, because the truth is darker than you think. The night the princes vanished was not like the others. London breathed heavily, as if the city itself knew it was witnessing something that should never be known. The wind barely moved, and even the Thames seemed to flow differently, slow, thick, as though it refused to carry away what was meant to remain hidden. The tower rose above the water, dark and unmoving. Its walls, built of cold stone, felt alive not because they moved, but because they remembered. They had absorbed too much. Whispers of conspiracies, the cries of the condemned, the final words of those who would never see the sunrise again. But that night, there were no screams. And that was what made it truly terrifying. There was no struggle, no noise, nothing that could explain what had happened. And yet by morning, something was missing from one of the rooms inside the tower. Two boys. They vanished the way only those disappear who are no longer meant to exist. Without a trace, without witnesses, without a story. The beds were neatly made, as if untouched. The window was closed. The door was locked. The guards swore that no one had entered, and no one had left. And that was true. Because on nights like this, doors are not opened. On nights like this, decisions are made differently. But that night was not the beginning. It was the end. A quiet, almost invisible conclusion to a game that had begun the day the king died. Edward IV should not have died so soon. His reign had been strong, if not flawless. He held the country in balance, preventing it from slipping back into the chaos that had only recently torn England apart. But death does not concern itself with politics or stability. It comes and it takes. And with his passing, England was left without the one thing it needed most: a grown ruler. The heir was his son Edward V, a boy of 12. Too young to understand what was happening, too important to be free. The crown had fallen into his hands before he ever had the chance to wear it. But in truth, it no longer belonged to him. Because in a world ruled by a child, someone else always rules in his place. The court fractured instantly. Families, alliances, advisors. Everyone chose a side, even those who pretended not to. But among them all, there was one man who did not choose a side. He created it. Richard III, brother of the dead king, uncle to the heir, a man respected, and, more importantly, trusted. He did not speak loudly. He did not make sudden moves. He did not display ambition. And that was precisely why no one stopped him. When the young king was being brought to London for his coronation, Richard moved to meet him. Everything appeared proper: duty, care, protection. But it was in that moment that everything changed. Those escorting the boy were arrested. Some were accused of conspiracy, some of treason. Some disappeared as quietly as the princes themselves would later. It was called necessity. It is always called necessity. Richard declared himself protector of the five, king, regent, the one who would rule until the boy came of age. And no one objected, because he did not seize power. He simply held it. Edward was brought to London and placed in the Tower. Officially, temporarily, until the coronation. Unofficially, because it was easier to control him there. The Tower was not just a fortress, it was an instrument, a place where people were not only kept, they were forgotten. A few days later, another boy was brought there, Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger brother. Now the heirs were together, and it almost looked like mercy. Almost. People saw them. At first, they played in the courtyard, ran across the cold stone, laughed like children who did not yet understand that their lives were no longer their own. They looked out of the windows. Sometimes they waved to passers-by. Sometimes they simply watched the world that was so close and already out of reach. But then, they began to disappear. First, they appeared less often. Then they stopped going into the courtyard. Then, the windows remained empty. People began to notice, but they did not speak, because speaking was dangerous, and silence was safer. Meanwhile, Richard made his final move. He did not take the crown by force. He took it by law. It was declared that the marriage of the boy's parents had been invalid, that the children were illegitimate, that they had no claim to the throne. It sounded absurd, but it was enough, because truth, in those times, was not what was real, it was what was accepted. And when Richard placed the crown upon his head, everything fell into place. Everything except one thing. The boys were still alive, and as long as they lived, the crown was not safe. From that moment, their existence became a threat, not because of what they did, but because they were. Sometimes, simply existing is enough to be dangerous. The tower changed again. The guards grew stricter, the doors heavier, the corridors quieter, as if the fortress itself understood that something was approaching, something from which there would be no return. And then, that night came. The one with no scream, the one with no witnesses, the one that left behind only a single thing, a question. What happened to the princes? There was no answer then. There is none now. But in that night, the crown finally ceased to be a symbol of power. It became what it had always truly been. Something paid for, sometimes with another's life, and sometimes with the lives of children. There are nights that should not exist. They leave no trace in chronicles. No one speaks of them aloud. Not even those who record every move of kings and every drop of blood spilled for power dare to write them down. And, yet, it is nights like these that change history. By the time that night arrived, everything had already been decided. The crown rested upon the head of Richard III, and from the outside, everything appeared calm. Too calm. He ruled with confidence, issued decrees, restored order, and many had even begun to believe that everything had happened as it was meant to, that it had been inevitable, that he was exactly the ruler the country needed. But beneath this new stability, something else lived: doubt. And doubt is the most dangerous thing that can exist beside a throne. It does not require armies. It does not require swords. It simply waits. As long as the boys were alive, the doubt remained. They did not oppose him. They gathered no supporters. They spoke no words. They simply existed. And that was enough. Sometimes, existence alone is a threat. The tower began to change. Not outwardly. It still rose above the river, still reflected in the dark water, still inspired fear. But inside, something was different. The guards spoke only when necessary. Footsteps grew quieter. Doors closed faster. Orders came short, without explanation. And no one asked why. Because in times like these, a question can be the last thing a man ever asks. The boys were no longer seen. At first, it seemed strange, then concerning, and then normal. People can grow used to anything, even the disappearance of heirs to the throne. But the rumors did not disappear. They simply became quieter and more dangerous. Some said the boys were ill. Some said they had been moved to another part of the tower. Some said they were still alive. And that was the most terrifying part, because no one knew for certain. Richard III said nothing. He did not confirm. He did not deny. He did not explain. And in that silence there was more meaning than in any words. That night came unnoticed, as all important things do. without warning, without signs. Even the sky was empty. No moon, no stars, no light. London slept, or pretended to. Deep within the tower, in places where wandering eyes could not reach, there were doors that did not open for everyone. And it was there, on that night, that someone entered. No one knows how many. No one knows who they were. But one thing is certain. They were not men who were questioned. They moved quietly, not because they feared being heard, but because they knew silence makes everything easier. The corridors let them pass, as if they recognized them, as if they had seen such things before. The room was dark. A torch beyond the door cast only a faint glow, barely touching the walls. Inside, it was warm and calm. The boys were asleep. One lay closer to the wall. The other turned toward his brother. They were together, and perhaps that was their final comfort. After that, the story becomes speculation, versions. Whispers passed from one generation to another. They say it happened quickly, without struggle, without noise. They say the boys never woke, that everything was done so, that no one would hear, so that no one would know, so that in the morning it could be said, nothing happened. And that was the most terrifying part, because sometimes the worst thing is not what happens, but what seems never to have happened at all. When it was over, the tower became what it had always been. Stone, cold, silent, unfeeling. But that was an illusion, because places like this forget nothing. The bodies, if there were bodies, were not found, or not searched for, or not meant to be found. History gives no answer, and perhaps it never will. Morning came quietly, too quietly. The guards took their posts. Servants carried out their duties. Everything looked as it always had, except for one thing. The boys were gone. At first, no one said anything. Then they began to ask, carefully, indirectly, as if they feared hearing the truth. But there was no answer. And that became the answer. Rumors began to grow, slowly at first, then faster. They moved through homes, through taverns, through the halls of nobility. They became part of conversations that ended the moment someone entered the room. Some said they were murdered. Others said they were hidden. Others still insisted it was all a lie, that the boys were alive. But the more versions there were, the further the truth drifted away. That is how truth disappears. Not all at once, but gradually, dissolving into words. Richard III remained silent. He ruled. He acted. He lived as if nothing had happened. And that was the strongest statement of all. But even kings cannot control everything. There are things that do not obey power, memory, fear, and doubt. With each passing day, they grew stronger, invisible, but real. They raised no armies. They led no rebellions. But they did something far more dangerous. They destroyed trust. And when trust disappears, a crown begins to crack, even if it still rests upon a king's head. And somewhere deep within the tower, where the stone is colder than the air, where light barely reaches, the story ended. But not for people, because people do not forget. They only pretend to. From that moment on, the question was no longer a rumor. It became a shadow, constant, unrelenting. What happened to the princes? And the most terrifying thing about that question was not that there was no answer, but that everyone already knew it. There are things that outlive death. Not people, not kingdoms, not even names, but stories. They do not die with those who create them. They do not vanish when witnesses disappear. They remain in words, in whispers, in doubt, and sometimes they become stronger than the truth itself. After that night, England did not change, at least not on the surface. The sun still rose over London. Markets opened, bells rang, life went on, and that was what made everything so unsettling. Because the most terrifying things do not happen when the world collapses, but when it pretends that nothing has happened at all. Richard III ruled with certainty, with control, without hesitation. He passed laws that strengthened the realm. He restored order where chaos once ruled. He governed as a king should. And perhaps that was his greatest mistake, because there was one thing he could not undo, something no one could see, but everyone could feel: doubt. It had no shape, no face, and yet it was everywhere, in conversations that ended too quickly, in glances that turned away too soon, in silence that grew heavier with each passing day. No one accused him openly. No one raised their voice, but that made it worse, because fear can silence protest. But it cannot silence thought, and the thought was simple. If the boys were alive, why had no one seen them? And if they were dead, who had killed them? The answer was too obvious, and that was precisely why no one spoke it aloud. A year passed, and then, as it always does, something shifted. A man appeared. He did not look like a prince. He did not speak like a prince, but he claimed to be one. He claimed to be the boy who had survived, the one who had escaped, the one who carried the truth. His name was not important. His words were, because people wanted to believe him. Belief is power, but in times like these, it becomes a weapon. Rumors became movement. Movement became conspiracy, and conspiracy became threat. The crown began to fracture, not suddenly, but slowly, like ice that seems solid, until the moment it breaks beneath your weight. Richard III felt it. He was not a fool. He understood what was happening. He saw how his support was weakening, how allies grew cautious, how shadows moved faster than men. But he did not step back, because by then, it was too late. And then came the day that decides the fate of kings. The Battle of Bosworth. The field was wet, heavy, as if the earth itself resisted what was about to happen. Armies stood facing one another. Silence before battle is different. It does not frighten. It warns. Richard III was there, not behind his soldiers, not in safety, at the front, like a man who understands that he has only one chance left. He did not run. He did not hide. He moved forward, because he knew if he stopped, everything would end. And if he went forward, everything would still end. History remembers his final stand, or perhaps it only remembers what it needs to. It does not matter. What matters is this: he fought to the end, and he died, on the field, with a sword in his hand, as a king. But death did not cleanse his name, because there are things that do not die with a man. The question remained, and it grew louder. What happened to the princes? Years passed, then decades, then centuries. History changed. Kings rose and fell. Empires were built and broken. But that question remained. People searched for answers, in documents, in stories, in rumors. And one day, they found something else. Bones. 2 small skeletons, hidden within the walls of the tower. It could have been proof. It could have been the end, but it was not, because even bones do not speak. And so it became clear, truth is not always something that can be found. Sometimes, it is something that remains forever out of reach. And still, the tower stands. The same walls, the same corridors, the same stone. They have seen more than any man, and perhaps they know the answer. Sometimes, at night, when the city falls silent and the wind moves through the ancient walls, it feels as though something is still there. Not a sound, not a step, but a presence, as if someone never truly left. Not ghosts, not shadows, but memory of 2 boys who were kings and vanished before they ever had the chance to become them. And perhaps the most terrifying thing about this story is not what happened to them, but that the world continued, as if nothing had ever happened.